Greetings, everyone. This is Rick Levine with your June astrological forecast for June of 2023. Before we jump into the material, I just want to mention a couple of things very quickly today. I am recording this on the evening of May 31st. And I just want to remind everyone that on Friday evening, June 2nd, at 6:30 p.m., I'll be present at Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington for the June astrology night that will be live streamed on YouTube. So if you're not in the area or you can't make the fun at Soul Food itself, feel free to watch it online. It will be posted afterward, so it will be available for you later on through the month. Secondly, we are quickly approaching the weekend at Omega Institute. In fact, the next month's forecast will be done. I will be at Omega on the weekend of June 30th, July 1st, and July 2nd. And that weekend, I will be joined by Ann Ortely, Maurice Fernandez, Rachel Lang, and Lynn Bell. And our program for the weekend is not how to do astrology. It's not astrology interpretation, but it's really what do we do about living in these times? And so here we are at a very unique moment in the evolution of humanity itself, and we are going to dig into that. Omega is an amazing place. It's just north of New York City, maybe about an hour or so in the Hudson Valley. It's a rural setting. It's a beautiful place. It has incredible history in the consciousness movement. People like Deepak Chopra, Ram Dass, Thich Nhat Hanh, Marianne Williamson, Wayne Dyer. I mean, the who's who of people who have graced Omega is incredible. I feel very privileged to be there. We do still have some room available, and I hope to see some of you there. That's June 30th through July 2nd, technically July 4th weekend. And then I just want to do a reminder that my 10-day workshop in Goa, India, in the southern part of Goa, December 6th through the 16th, is actually, it's about half full right now, and we're still a good five months plus away. So if you're interested in that, or if that sounds interesting to you, check out the link at Heaven and Earth Workshops. I'll put all the links, that's Heaven and Earth Workshops.com. I'll put all the links in the top comment below here on YouTube. There is a full complete day-by-day schedule and curriculum. Goa is going to be an amazing period of time that's going to be very exciting and a lot of fun. And it's at a magical place that's an Ayurvedic healing spa just up from the beach in the southern part of Goa. It's very manageable, very easy to deal with. And I look forward to seeing many of you there also. And that's it. So I personally am on a bit of a high because I've spent the weekend at NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference, and it was just amazing. I mean, I think there were probably about 450 to 500 people there. It was just the largest NORWAC that I think perhaps ever. And it, for me, was very exciting because it was the first NORWAC in decades. This was my 33rd NORWAC. It was the first NORWAC in decades where I was neither a speaker nor was I writing a daily column. And so I got to enjoy the lectures and the people and a party. Some of you were there for my reception for my fans, YouTube followers, and patrons. It was a blast, and it was really great to connect with so many of you. It was just a fantastic weekend. Now, that all being said, we are looking ahead to the astrology of June. And, you know, at the beginning of every month, we never know how it's going to play out. but there's always a feeling for the month. And the feeling for the month of June is, I think there's a lot that goes on in personal interactions. There's a lot that goes on that's events happening, but there's not a lot that's major events, at least astrologically. You never know what smaller transits, what transits of the sun and Venus and Mercury and Venus and Mars, actually, you never know what those transits might trigger. And there are some larger events that have occurred that we might see some triggers to those, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot that's going to be surprising to us. Now, we do need to keep in mind that Pluto, which had moved into Aquarius in March and then turned retrograde early in May, is now backing into Capricorn, where it will remain for the rest of the year. Now, arguably, that is a big event, because that's, even though Pluto will tip back into Capricorn again, just quickly, barely, this is like the longest, this is like a 7-month stay. And it's long enough that Pluto gets to do the work that it needs to do, that it hasn't finished, as it has deconstructed those things which are very Capricornian, meaning stable institutions, things like banks, government, the Constitution of the United States even, fundamental building blocks of our country, like buildings and roads and bridges and all governmental institutions. And we saw the real estate collapse and the financial dealing with that when Pluto, around the time that Pluto was first touching into Capricorn back in 2008. And when Pluto was just in the process of leaving Capricorn, moving into Aquarius, we saw another run of bank instability. And I would imagine that as Pluto backs into Capricorn, we may see a bit more of that. So that's one thing to look out for. But I think in general, the fact that Pluto is moving back into Capricorn, and that occurs on June 11th. And I often say that with these slower moving planets, that it's not so much about the day of the exact ingress or the day of the exact transit. However, sometimes it is. And so we may want to look at that June 11th, 12th, 13th as a period of time where we may see clues as to what issues may become more important or powerful over the months ahead, while Pluto for the rest of the year is doing the work that it needs to finish up back in Capricorn. Now, we have in this 3-month period, let's see, it was part of March to April to May to June. Yeah, it was about a 3-month period with Pluto in Aquarius. And we've certainly seen some things that are playing that we'll probably dig into a whole lot more culturally over the years ahead, including technology stuff, including artificial intelligence, including quantum computers, including a reorganization or a reshuffling of our relationship with the government in particular, because Aquarius has to do with social structure or the social stratification, if you will. So that's one thing, and we're going to get a play on that this month in June, especially as planets change signs. Why is that? Because Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius until June 11th, and then at 29 degrees of Capricorn. We'll see planets as they change signs. They will conjunct or square. Well, the moon will conjunct, but the other planets will be squaring and or opposing Pluto. And in fact, what we will see is Venus opposing Pluto on June 5th, and then the Sun making a a sesqui square with Pluto also on June 5th. So that may be an interesting day of stuff coming out into the open. And then on June 11th, Mercury makes a trine to Pluto as Mercury moves from Taurus into as Mercury moves from Taurus into Gemini, and at the last degree of Taurus, Pluto will already be backed up to 29 degrees and 59 minutes of Capricorn. We'll see this in a chart in a few minutes. But just before Mercury changes signs, it will make that trine to Pluto. And then by the 19th, because Mercury is moving rather quickly right now, coming out of its shadow actually on May 31st, today, the day that I'm recording this, meaning that Mercury is now moving into new territory, territory where it hasn't been yet. Remember, Mercury turned retrograde. Mercury turned retrograde back in April, the end of April, April 22nd. And it turned retrograde at 15.5 degrees of Taurus, just barely reaching a conjunction with Uranus. And so we may have been left a bit frustrated that the intellectual breakthrough didn't quite occur. And then it retrograded back all the way to early Taurus, turned direct back mid-May, May 14th. And then as it moved direct, it moved through that same 15.5 degree of Taurus point where it actually turned retrograde back at the end of April. Now, what that means is not only that Mercury is now moving into new territory where it hasn't been. Even though Mercury has been moving direct for the second part of May, it's still been moving direct through familiar territory, and now it's moving into new territory. This is significant because Mercury will actually catch up finally with Uranus, which it didn't do. Remember, it turned retrograde just before it reached Uranus, and it will actually join up with Uranus on June 4th. So again, we can expect some real excitement, mental breakthrough, since Friday is the second, Saturday the 3rd, Sunday the 4th, we may see things kind of come out into the open and some major breakthroughs on things by June 4th. And actually June 4th and 5th, I think, are really potent days, and we'll get to them in just a moment also. But this idea that the planets are activating Pluto as Pluto is in the process of changing signs, I still think is an important thing to hang on to. In fact, we will also get Mercury making, so we have Mercury making the trine with Pluto on June 11th, the same day that Pluto actually backs into Capricorn. And then on June 19th, Mercury, because it's moving so quickly, will make a sesqui square with Pluto, again, rattling Pluto's nerves or a cage or whatever you want to call it. And then on June 21st, the Sun will make a quincunx with Pluto. And on June 26th, Mercury will make a quincunx with Pluto. And so Pluto is kind of getting, except for the trine from Mercury on the day that Pluto backs into Capricorn, Pluto's getting rattled a number of times with difficult aspects, but we will see that more as we unfold the month day by day. Now, the other thing I want to mention, which I kind of already did, is the fact that Mercury throughout the month of June is moving in new territory. It's gaining speed. In fact, Mercury has been in Taurus since April 4th. And on June 10th, Mercury moves out of Taurus and into Gemini, but Mercury has picked up enough speed that it will fly through Gemini, and it enters Cancer before the end of the month on June 26th. So we're going to see Mercury really kind of stirring up. Mercury is going to be stirring up the pot, moving through new territory, moving through an entirely new sign into Gemini, where it's at home, and out of Gemini into Cancer by the end of the month. And that can really stir up some energy. So we're going to look at Mercury as perhaps the communicator, the mischief maker. And of course, Mercury is also the psychopomp, the planet that the god that led souls on their journeys between the worlds. And we can expect Mercury, as it's moving through new territory this month, to maybe take us on some of those journeys. So we shall see. The other thing that happens this month is that we do have a couple of planets that are turning retrograde. And we've been in this phase where everything has been direct, except Pluto turned retrograde last month. And now this month in June, Saturn turns retrograde on the 17th at 7 degrees of Pisces. Remember, Saturn moved into Pisces back in March. It's moved through maybe about a fifth of the way through the sign, something like that. On June 1st, Saturn is at almost 7 degrees of Pisces. It's at 6 degrees Pisces and 59 minutes at midnight on June 1st. And by June 17th, when it turns retrograde, it's moved less than a quarter of a degree. It's only at 7 degrees of Pisces and 13 minutes. And by the end of the month, Saturn is still at 7 degrees. It's still at 7 degrees of Pisces and 5 minutes. So Saturn is also doing some work this month, because the slower moving a planet goes around its station, retrograde or direct, it garners more energy, more potency. And I think it's quite significant that as the month opens, Saturn is already, moving very slowly, but it's at 6 degrees and 59 minutes, and it is quincunxed by Mars, and we will look at a chart in just a moment and see that. But before we shift to the view of the charts and the day by day, I just also want to mention that by the end of the month, because Neptune is slowing down also, on the opening day of the month, Neptune is at 27 degrees, 27 and a half degrees just about. It's 27 degrees and 27 minutes of Pisces. And by the end of the month, when Neptune turns retrograde, it's at 27 degrees and 41 minutes of Pisces, meaning that Neptune doesn't move a quarter of a degree throughout the entire month. So we're seeing Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto all moving really, really, really slowly. And this is kind of creating some non-movement, but everything else, all the noise, all the moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and even Jupiter, which is moving quite quickly right now, they're all stirring up the action within these kind of slow-moving planets, really, really holding their own. So we have an interesting state where the outer planets are all slowing down this month, and I think that has a message of its own. So let's take a look at the chart for June 1st, and we're going to look at the chart for noon. And also, just as a reminder, all times that I use during today's forecast, during all my forecasts, are Pacific. Now we're on daylight time, Pacific daylight time. So it's still 8 hours to London, but it's 7 hours for Greenwich Mean Time or Universal Time because of our daylight savings time. So here we are looking at a chart for noon on June 1st, and we can see that the month begins with the moon in Scorpio, and that moon in Scorpio on the morning of June 1st will make a square to Mars in Leo and a trine to Saturn in Pisces. But what we notice is that we can see the applying quincunx, the quincunx between Mars and and Saturn, and that is exact at 12:30 p.m. And so this chart is just for, you can see Mars is just 1 minute of orb away from being exactly quincunx to Saturn. And Mars-Saturn quincunxes are a bit unnerving, uncomfortable. Why? Because the principle of forward movement and assertion and direction is being thwarted a bit by Saturn, the planet of boundaries and constriction. It's like Mars is the gas and Saturn is the brake. And in a way, this quincunx means that the two of them are making adjustments and they can't quite get it right, or there's needs to be compromise on both sides. In the United States, we're seeing this certainly as the financial situation that's moving through the House and the Senate. Even though there's compromises, there's uneasiness on both sides, because on both sides of the aisle, and it's just one way in which we see this Mars quincunx to Saturn. But we also have a very propitious signal on the first of the month, and that is that Jupiter at 3 degrees of Taurus is in fact crossing over the nodal axis. And in some ways, this really stimulates opportunities that are cycling around from other times, other places from the past that are resonant to deeper issues. And I think that because it's conjoining the North Node, this is giving us a glimpse of the potential and the possibilities of what's ahead. By June 2nd, we have Venus making a trine with Neptune. And although we'll be feeling this even at the beginning of the month on the 1st, the trine is exact at 3:42 p.m. And this is kind of a sweet energy that is being amplified even more by the moon going through Scorpio, because at noon you can see that the moon is at 24 degrees of Scorpio, Neptune is at 27 degrees of Pisces, and Venus is at 27 degrees of water. The moon is moving toward a grand water trine. And so in many ways, even though the sun is in airy Gemini, and even though we have 3 planets in Taurus, we're getting a whole lot of water energy right now with Venus and Neptune. Arguably, Venus and Neptune, when they get along really well. I mean, there's a sweetness, and Neptune is considered to be the higher octave of Venus. And so we have the moon really highlighting that energy, and this is a really good day to connect into our emotional state, into our feelings. And again, I'm just mentioning that on Friday evening, June 2nd, I'll be live at Soul Food Coffee House. And if you can't make it there, you can certainly watch it online. But it should be a pretty fun and kind of a really community-oriented event. I'm looking forward to it. Now, by the following day, the 3rd, we can see that the moon, as it moves into Sagittarius, and the moon actually ingresses into Sagittarius at 10:03 p.m. on the evening of June 2nd. And once the moon is in Sagittarius, it'll be moving pretty quickly toward mid-Sagittarius, where it will create a full moon at 13 degrees 18 minutes of Sagittarius at 8:41 p.m. on the evening of June 3rd. Now, this full moon on June 3rd, in the evening on June 3rd, is quite intriguing because it creates a very potent configuration. Now, we're still working on the Venus trine Neptune, and that's still going to be a sweet energy. It's going to be there. But the thing that's of interest is that as Venus approaches its ingress into Leo, and I mentioned this before I brought charts up, that as Venus moves into Leo on June 5th, Venus will also exactly oppose Pluto. And it'll do that. Venus will oppose Pluto on the morning of June 5th, just a few hours after it moves into Leo, because Pluto is just ready to change signs. But here on June 3rd at the full moon, what we have is the moon in mid-Sagittarius making a half square to Pluto, while the sun is making a half square to Venus, which means that at the same time, the moon is making a square and a half to Venus, while the sun is making a square and a half to Pluto. What we have here is the full moon is occurring on both points of a point of Thor. Now, many of you I know from, if you've listened to me a lot, you know that the point of Thales is when a planet is making a sextile to one side of an opposition and a trine to the other side of an opposition. The point of Thor is when a planet is making a half a square to one side of an opposition and a square and a half to the other side. So this is an agitation, and it's not comfortable. And so we have this Venus-Pluto opposition, which is still growing or applying until the morning of the 5th, until Tuesday morning. But in the meantime, this full moon is really exacerbating that applying opposition, and we're getting a buzz that is not easy to take. And again, I'm expecting that by Monday the 5th, we may see a whole bunch of stuff that kind of comes, around on one level or another, because Venus will be moving into Leo. We'll look at this chart in just a moment. But remember, on the 4th, which I've also mentioned earlier, and we're going to move the chart now from Saturday the 3rd to Sunday the 4th, and what we will see is that around noon, actually at 12:49 p.m., Mercury lines up with Uranus. Here at noon, you can see Mercury is just a few minutes away from its conjunction to Uranus, and we're getting this buzz already at the full moon, and we're getting it even more now. So I think things are going to build over the weekend. It's an exciting energy. But, sometimes when things come out in the open, it's not necessarily what we want to hear. It's not necessarily pleasing. And yet when lightning strikes, what we see is those things that have been kind of buried. And so June 4th in midday, we get that. And again, that's on the Sunday. But it might take until Monday when we have the Venus moving into Leo, and that will be on June 5th. And Venus moves into Leo at 6:46 a.m., and then it opposes Pluto by 9:04 a.m. So I would look at Monday morning, June 5th, for a whole bunch of stuff to happen at once, whatever it might be. And the other thing is that, as I talked about, that Sun's semi-square to Venus and its sesqui-square to Pluto, that also perfects on June 5th. The Sun makes its square and a half to Pluto at 5:27 p.m., and then the Sun makes its half square to Venus, not for another couple of days, because Venus is actually moving pretty quickly right now. That it doesn't happen until the 13th. But it holds its position because the Sun and Venus are moving pretty closely to the same speed right now, which means that even on June 5th, with the sun Venus. This is already a semi-square that's very close, and it holds that position for almost a whole week. So I can imagine that there may be some discomfort from what comes out early in the week on Monday, on June 5th, and throughout the first part of that week. So this is a pretty rock and roll day. By June 7th, early in the morning, the moon moves from Capricorn into Aquarius, and it will join up with Pluto. This is just after midnight. And by midday on June 7th, that is Wednesday, the moon has moved into Aquarius, meaning that the moon sweeps through that kind of lingering T-square, which is Venus opposite Pluto, and Venus coming still into the square to Jupiter, but Jupiter square to Pluto is waning. That was exact last month. And the thing is, though, that as the moon sweeps through those early degrees of Aquarius on Wednesday morning, June 7th, we get kind of this reactivation of the discomfort and of that Pluto being opposed by Venus and having to go really, really deep in order to find the meaning and to find what it is that we're looking for. Remember, Venus's opposition to Pluto in some ways is about the discomfort of going into places that are uncomfortable, and yet that's where the riches are, even love. Thomas More, the guy who wrote Soulmates and The Reenchantment of Soul and Everyday Life and all of those books, wrote a book called Dark Eros. And in it, he talks about how Venus isn't just sweet and pretty and pleasant, that in order to get the full spectrum of love, there is a darker side of it also. And I think that when Venus opposes Pluto, and again, that was exact on the 5th, when Venus moved into Leo and opposed Pluto, I think we get a flavor of that deeper, darker energy, which can be very, very powerful and transformative. So by the time we get to June 8th, however, now we have Venus that's moved along, and it's picking up on the square to the nodal axis. When planets square the nodal axis, in evolutionary astrology, in a natal chart, this is called the skip step. We kind of get an opportunity to resettle an old score, if you will. Those things which we've ignored, those things which we haven't dealt with about a particular planet, here, in this case, it's Venus. And in fact, all year, Pluto is kind of toying with that square to the nodes from the other side, and the nodes moving retrograde will back into the square to Pluto. But right now we have Venus making the square to the nodes, and it's almost like we get a chance in this moment to pay attention to Venus in a way that maybe we weren't paying attention to before. And this is intriguing because Venus, although it's square to the nodal axis, is exact on June 8th. The fact of the matter is that Venus is also coming into a square to Jupiter, and that Venus square to Jupiter is going to exacerbate the energy even more. It's going to turn it into a bigger, better, more kind of scenario. And that's exact on June 11th, incidentally, another really big day. But right now on June 8th, we have Venus squaring the nodes. We also have the sun at a half square and a half to the nodes. I think that this whole period of time from the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th is going to take some adjustments, going to take some work to make it all work. And yet, by the 9th, we have kind of a little bit of a more flowing energy when Mercury makes a sextile to Neptune, and that's in the afternoon of the 9th, followed by the Sun making a sextile to Chiron. Both of these situations are opportunities for settling the energy. The Mercury sextile Venus on the 9th gives us the ability to use our imagination, to use our creativity to talk through some things. We can't get too hung up in the details because Neptune doesn't do well with details. But the fact is that even though it doesn't, Mercury is still in Taurus, and we can really do some good communication here on Friday the 9th. And by Saturday the 10th, when the Sun makes its sextile to Chiron, we have another opportunity. This one is for healing. This one is for doing deeper work that we have kind of maybe missed in the past, that we can kind of come back, cycle around, and take an opportunity for either whether it's forgiveness or healing of some sort. There's something here that gives us a chance to use our own being in some way to forgive or to process information that may have been holding us back. Now, and by the way, the moon is moving through Pisces. On June 9th, it actually catches up with Saturn midday, and by June 10th, the moon catches up. No, it doesn't really catch up with Neptune until early hours on Sunday, June 11th. And on June 11th at 6:20 a.m., the moon moves into Aries, and Sunday, June 11th, is a pretty powerful day. And again, we may feel some of the energy more on Monday when we get back into the swing of things. But on Sunday, first of all, we have the moon moving into Aries. Secondly, we have Pluto retrograding back into Capricorn, and that actually does that on June 11th at 2:30 a.m. And we also have that same day, just a couple of hours later, 3 hours later actually, we have Mercury moving into Gemini. And remember, Mercury has been in Taurus, even with a few days of excitation as it joined up with Uranus back around June 4th, or back around the full moon, and then June 3rd, 4th, and 5th, but exact on June 4th. Mercury finally leaves the steady ground of Taurus and enters into Gemini, where Mercury is at home. So it's almost like when Mercury moves into Gemini, it's like our whole intellectual thinking process, the ability to connect dots, to connect this experience with that, this idea with that, this person with that person. And there's just this whole movement of adaptation that begins to occur as Mercury moves through Gemini. And remember, it moves through Gemini from June 11th through June 26th, because on June 26th, the Mercury moves out of Gemini into Cancer. So we're back at June 11th. We also have on this day Venus squaring Jupiter, which I talked about earlier. We can overdo. This is about extravagance. This is about taking risks for pleasure, for money. And again, although this is technically on a Sunday, we might see some of this stuff just from a practical standpoint follow through on Monday. But we also have the Sun making a half square with Jupiter at this point in time. And so we have the Sun making a half square with Jupiter on one side and Venus on the other. We talked about that earlier also. But the half square with Venus doesn't happen until the 13th. But during this period of time, we're getting that Venus square Jupiter with the Sun moving right through that middle point. And so again, there's agitation. It's not all that comfortable. Meanwhile, while Mercury moves from Taurus into Gemini, it forms a trine with Pluto. having just backed into Capricorn. And so we have Pluto backing into Capricorn, Mercury making a trine with it, and then Mercury changing signs all within a few hours, all within really an hour and a half early in the morning. That's at between, let's say 2:30 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. Really within an hour. It's kind of crazy. And so there can be real movement, dynamic movement during this point in time. The actual Venus square to Jupiter isn't exact until 8:39 a.m. And then the Sun half square to Jupiter not until early afternoon West Coast, and that's 1:28 p.m. But all in all, this day is just an intense day. It's just a very, very powerful day. That's on Sunday. On Monday, of course, the moon continues on its journey through Aries, picking up on trines to both Venus and Mars, which are moving closer and closer together in Leo. And remember, this Venus in Leo is interesting because Venus stays in Leo forever. We'll talk more. I say forever. Venus turns retrograde in Leo. So Venus normally runs through a sign, and we have a prolonged Venus in Leo, and I'll talk a lot more about that later on and on the mid-month update, and certainly next month when Venus makes its station in Leo. But what we're getting is with Venus in Leo, we're getting a sense of kind of love being out in the open, of putting on the show. This is in a way, when we talked about the Venus opposition to Pluto, which happened still while it was just when it moved into Leo, there's this sense, this is kind of like a deeper confrontation between expressing love and having to repress it, or having to suppress it, or it being repressed. And we can look at this just as an example of the social pushes that are pushing back against expression of love and creativity and presentation, whether it's expressing oneself through reading stories to kids dressed as in drag, or whether it's pushing back against by homophobia or fear of trans, or just this whole process in some ways I think is really being brought out into the open more as Venus moves through Leo, because Venus in Leo wants to strut its stuff. It wants to show how it loves. And so I think once it gets through the opposition to Pluto early in the month, we might see more of that Venus stuff. And certainly as Venus makes that square to Jupiter around June 11th. But as we push on, by the 13th, where we have, let's get here to the 13th. By the 13th, we have the Sun making a half square to Venus. This is a bit exacerbating. There's just a little bit of angst. And we also have Venus making a quincunx with Saturn. This, I think, is significant because in some ways this again goes back to the difficulty of expressing one's self, one's love, even one's procreative energy, because it's Venus in Leo that in some ways is being restrained by laws of the land, the rules, the statutes, Saturn, and that Venus quincunx to Saturn on Tuesday, June 13th might produce some energy with respect to those issues. Not that it's not always there, but things might kind of play out a little bit wider during that period of time, more out in the open. The next thing that we have is, and also on the 13th, the moon ingresses from Aries into Taurus, and it does that at 11:31 a.m. on June 13th, and it stays in Taurus all the way through the 15th. And on the 15th, we have something that's very significant, and that is Mercury moving through Gemini. On the 15th, we have Mercury making a square to Saturn. Mercury picks up on that square exactly at 9:09 a.m. on June 15th. At 7 degrees 12 minutes of Gemini, 7 minutes and 7 degrees and 12 minutes of Pisces is where Saturn is, and remember, Saturn is pretty much stationary because it's at 7 degrees 12 minutes on Thursday the 15th, but it's at 7 degrees 13 minutes 2 days later. That's 1 minute of arc that it's moved in 2 days as it actually stations retrograde on the 17th. So this 15th, 16th, 17th, we're getting tied up in communication. We're meeting blockages, or we're also developing things that are really structurally sound, because that Mercury square Saturn may feel restrained or self-restrained, or like something is holding us back. At the same time, that often forces us to get real and to crystallize energy. And because Saturn is also stationing during this period of time, and that on the 15th is when Mercury makes that square to Saturn. But as the moon moves into Gemini, and the moon moves into Gemini late on the 15th at 6:45 p.m., the moon is now moving toward its new moon, toward its conjunction with the sun. That occurs on June 17th. And on June 17th, the moon actually catches up to the sun at 9:37 p.m., and again, all times are Pacific times. And this is an incredibly potent new moon. The ruler of the new moon is Mercury in its domicile, in its home sign. And the sun and moon conjunction, the new moon in Gemini, is very closely square Neptune. And so we have an issue here with the potential of being misled, the potential of being confused. It is a square, and sometimes Neptune squares can be like, it's almost like something from AI is used to create something that goes viral and everyone bites into it, believes it, and it has some ramifications. I'm not saying that'll happen. I'm using that as an image, as an illustration of in fact what could happen. One of the reasons it's so significant is that it occurs at 26 degrees Gemini, 43 minutes. That's almost 27 degrees of Gemini. We have Neptune at 27 degrees 38 minutes, or 27 degrees of Pisces. So this new moon is very closely square Neptune. In fact, the moon will make its exact square to Neptune just a couple of hours after the new moon itself, and the sun will make its exact square to Neptune the following day at 8:53 p.m., and we'll move on to the 18th in just a moment. But here on the 17th, we have Saturn stationary. We have Saturn stationary retrograde. We have the new moon itself squaring Neptune, which can lead us to be misled by someone outright lying to us. We have to pay particular careful attention so that we don't misinterpret what we're being told, but we also have to pay attention that we're screening out those things which are presented to us as fact and are, in fact, not fact. That sounded silly. In fact, they are not fact. That's what I mean. Okay, so this is all important as part of the new moon itself. And yet one of the things that is significant here is that we also have Venus and Mars getting closer and closer together in Leo. We'll talk more about that Venus in Leo, later on, because Venus, as we mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned earlier, turns retrograde in Leo, and it spends a very long time in Leo. But the other thing that's occurring here around the time of this new moon on the 17th is that Mercury Mercury in Gemini is making a sextile to Venus in Leo. And so we're on top of everything else, getting this ability to communicate that is, on one hand, it's being blocked a bit by Saturn. It's being confused a bit by Neptune, and yet we still have this ability to sweet talk. We have this ability to use that Mercury at home in Gemini to communicate those things that are nice, that are loving, that appear loving. And so the antennas are up here. We need to pay attention to what's going on. As we move forward on the 18th, the moon moves into Cancer. It moves into Cancer at 3:57 a.m. And of course, as it does, it will then make a trine with Saturn. And that will happen in the afternoon on Sunday, June 18th. And that'll also be very close in time to the sun's square to Neptune. And so we're kind of getting this, let's make it grounded, but we're still able to use our creative imagination. That would be the positive side of that sun squaring Neptune. As we approach the 19th, there's something else that's occurring that is kind of a sleeper. It's kind of quiet, but it's incredibly important. This is something that we're getting we'll be getting a repeat version on. And what's happening is that retrograde Saturn is backing into a sextile with Jupiter, and that is exact on the 19th at 8:53 a.m. But these are slow enough moving planets that this is in operation for several days. And it gives us, in some ways, this is a saving grace to the sun square to Neptune, because this is giving us a way to ground the energy. This is giving us a way to, Jupiter is in Taurus, and its sextile to Saturn is giving us a way to take these potential, the potential energy that we're feeling, and the possibility, and using our intuition, using our emotions to, in fact, find a balance point between the opportunity and expansion of Jupiter and the resistance and contraction and make it realness of Saturn. So I think that the June 18th, 19th period is very important. We also have Mercury making a square and a half to Pluto and Venus making a square and a half to Neptune. There's a lot of noise going on this Monday and even on into Tuesday, Wednesday, because what's happening is we're getting very close to the end of spring here in the Northern Hemisphere. And as the moon is moving through Cancer, the sun just behind it, by the 21st, the sun will actually ingress or move into Cancer. And that occurs exactly at 7:57 a.m. on Wednesday, June 21st. This is the summer solstice, and this is the moment at which we have in the northern hemisphere the most light, least dark in the day, or within a few days of that. And I think it's very important because the solstice is actually the beginning of the next season. Remember, the cardinal signs are the season openers. Aries opens spring. The sun's ingress into Cancer opens summer. The sun moving into Libra, it begins fall, and the sun moving into Capricorn begins winter. Obviously, in the southern hemisphere, these are all reversed. But we're getting here a change of dynamics, and it's on this day, on the 21st, that Mercury makes its exact sextile to Mars. Remember, it made a sextile to Venus just a couple days ago. And so this is a pretty dynamic period of time where even though the sun is standing still in its move from south to north and back to south again, that Mercury through this whole period of time in its home sign is picking up on sextiles, first to Venus, then to Mars. And in fact, on the 21st, the moon moving through Leo, and the moon entered Leo on the 20th at 3:04 p.m., the moon actually sweeps across Venus and Mars, and therefore makes a sextile with Mercury also. So we have this really strong energy on Wednesday, the 21st, on through the afternoon and on into the evening, and even through the wee hours of the morning on Thursday, the 22nd, when the moon actually completes its conjunction with Mars and its sextile to Mercury. Very strong communication days, very powerful. And incidentally, at the same time, Mercury is picking up on a sextile from the other side to Chiron. And we notice here that we have Mars and the moon, therefore, both making a trine to Chiron, with Mercury at the halfway point, all at about 19 degrees, the moon sweeping through that, and Venus still coming into it. And I think that this Mars-Chiron energy, which is exact on the evening of the 22nd, that's Thursday, is an absolute wonderful opportunity to learn, to heal, to forgive, to move forward, to take what we've learned and to put it into practice. This is Mars. This is physical, and these are fire. This is a fire trine, Aries to Leo, and I think that this is an amazing day because with Mercury we can really pick up the pieces and communicate. Now, the other thing, though, that's happening is as the sun moves from Gemini into Cancer just before the solstice itself, I mean, just a few hours before the solstice, the sun will make an exact quincunx with Pluto, once more exacerbating that kind of the requirement of going deeper, even if we don't want to. It doesn't matter. We have to. We have to take the trip into the underworld to bring the light into the dark so that we can process things and move forward. By the 23rd, Mercury is making a half square with Jupiter. And again, this can be an overdoing, maybe just, taking things too far, saying things that we maybe shouldn't have said. And this is coupled with the fact that by the 25th, incidentally, the moon moves out of Leo, ingresses into Virgo on June 23rd at 3:35 a.m. That's on Friday morning. But during this period of time, we still have Venus and Mars growing closer together. And they are also moving closer to the sun, but they'll still be visible in the evening, and we'll be able to see that conjunction just after the sun sets during this period of time. So that brings us up to the 23rd, the moon moving through Virgo and on through the 24th. By the time we get to the 25th, we have Mercury making an exact square with Neptune, once again befuddling us, confusing us with what's true, what's not, what's fake news, what's real news, what do we believe, what don't we believe. And it's during this same period of time on Sunday the 25th that the moon, moving through latter degrees of Virgo, by midday, by noon actually, will be making a square to Mercury, an opposition to Neptune, making a T-square, but that moon will also be making a trine to Pluto, and Pluto here becomes the release energy. It's now easier to dig into the underworld. In fact, we almost have to, because what's happening on the surface is just not making as much sense as we need it to. And incidentally, what will happen is that as that moon moves from Virgo into Libra, which it does at 3:57 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, and again, the moon not only picks up on the trine to Pluto, but it will then be applying to its first quarter, which means that it will be squaring the sun, and this occurs right at the very beginning of the, well, actually, just before midnight as the day changes from Sunday to Monday. So it's really, and it actually occurs just after midnight, like maybe a few minutes after midnight on Monday morning, June 26th. We have the moon squaring the sun, and we still have Mercury squaring Neptune. So this, I think, is a tough little energy for just a little bit. We still, though, are getting a little bit of a play, not only from Mars's recent trine to Chiron, but Venus is applying to a trine to Chiron that's not exact till the 29th. But if you look at this chart for noon on the 26th, on Monday the 26th, we can see that the halfway point between Venus and Mars is at about 19 and then some, 19 and a half degrees, a little bit more than that even, of Leo. And we look at that and we see how the midpoint of Venus and Mars is trining Chiron. So now we're getting this ability again to pull that energy in and to really get a... what's the word I'm looking for? We're getting a really strong ability to heal and to break through some things, and we're getting an additional thrust to break through, because as Mars reaches that 21 degrees of Leo, Mars at 2:22 a.m. on Monday morning, Mars will square Uranus. And remember, we had the Mercury conjuncting Uranus back at the beginning of the month, back on June 4th. Now with Mars squaring Uranus, now with Mars squaring Uranus, and then Venus coming into the square to Uranus, that's not exact till next month, we're getting this sense of there's some real unrest, but we can learn from it. Why? The unrest is from the Mars square Uranus, that powerful assertion, aggression, dynamic force, Mars showing its stuff in Leo is kind of meeting this immovable object of irrepressible, I say immovable, it's like Uranus is going to express and we can't prevent it from expressing. It's still coming up, but it's at odds, Mars and Venus, but Mars in particular, squaring Uranus is very strong, and yet we can heal from it, we can work through it, because we're getting that trine from the Mars-Venus-Mars midpoint back to Chiron. These are incredibly powerful days as we move toward the end of the month. And in fact, we have the sun moving, inching day by day, a degree a day, closer and closer to its trine to Saturn. And by early morning on Wednesday, June 28th, we have the moon moving out of Libra into Scorpio, where it will then make another round of trines, making a grand trine with the sun. Now it's the sun in Cancer, Mercury at 3 degrees, the sun at 6 degrees, trining Saturn at 7 degrees of Pisces, and the moon, as it moves through Scorpio, will actually pick up on that. And this is almost like a replay of the same energy that we had back at the beginning of the month. But at the beginning of the month, we had the moon in Scorpio making a grand trine, not with Saturn in Pisces, but with Neptune in Pisces. And it was trining that Neptune in Pisces and and Venus in Cancer, and that was back on June 2nd at the very opening of the month. So as the moon moves through Scorpio again at the end of the month, we're picking up on another trine, and another grand trine, but this one's very different because this has the energy of Saturn rather than the energy of Neptune, which the one at the opening of the month did. This is giving us a chance to ground our feelings. This is giving us a chance to really pull in and to establish an intuitive, solid ground that we can actually take action on. Now, remember, the moon, as it moves into Scorpio, is crossing over the lunar axis, the lunar nodal axis, which is now retrograded back to 1 degree. It's 1 degree 51 minutes. But this is a very powerful grand water trine, emotional self-sufficiency with the south node of the moon and the moon itself, Saturn, Mercury, and the sun all resonant. And at the same time, we also now have Venus. Remember, we had Mars trining Chiron, and then we had the Venus-Mars midpoint trining Chiron. And now we have Venus on the 29th trining Chiron. The sun's just still coming off of its trine to Saturn. This is all about stabilization. This is all about making things stable. There is a bit of a kind of a it's like there's a bit of a stirring up of the energy when the moon moves through mid-degrees of Scorpio later on the 29th, and it opposes Uranus and squares both Venus and Mars. But I think ultimately by the end of the month, it's the sun's trine Saturn that is exact on late on June 28th. And by June 29th, we have the Venus trine Chiron. And then by later on June 29th, 11:23 p.m., actually, that we have Mercury coming in behind the sun and Mercury trining Saturn right on the heels of Neptune turning retrograde on the 30th. And all of this is incredibly powerful. And we end the month on June 30th with Neptune making its station on Friday, June 30th, and the sun being conjoined by Mercury. This is a superior conjunction, meaning that if you drew a straight line, or if you draw a straight line on the 30th from the Earth toward the sun at 8 degrees of Cancer, and you go through the sun on the far side of the sun, Mercury moving direct. Remember, when Mercury is conjunct the sun retrograde, it's inside the sun. And so we have this ability to use our consciousness, the sun, our willpower, the sun, our vitality, the sun, and to communicate Mercury in a very stable, grounded, practical, enduring, and yet emotional way with Saturn and Pisces because of that trine. And yet, because it's in Cancer, the Sun and Mercury, we may not be incredibly vocal. A lot of this may occur on levels of holding energy in, and it's almost like what we don't say becomes as important as what we do say. June turns out to be a really intriguing month because of the fact that the outer planets are, and I know I said this at the very beginning, are not moving a whole lot. And in fact, there is some either stabilization or retrogradation in the outer planet energy. And yet the inner planets are stirring up a lot of noise. They're stirring up a lot of stuff. We'll have to see how it plays out. But I think that ultimately we may feel like we're making personal progress, but socially, culturally, we may feel like it's still going to take some time for us to get there, wherever it is that we may be going. That's it for now. Those of you who are patrons at the solar level, that's the $3 a month. I'll see you for a mid-month update. We'll dig into that Venus retrograde that's coming up in July. We'll dig into it a bit more because Venus will be spending so much time in Leo. We'll have some other things to talk about at the mid-month update also. The rest of you I will see for the July update. And remember, though, that this Friday night, for those of you who are watching this early in the month, I'll be live streaming the Soul Food Astrology Night from Redmond, Washington. For those of you who live in the Seattle area, you may want to stop by. It's a fun evening. Also, just for the record, and I'll announce this again next month, I will not be at Astrology Night at Soul Food, because I will be at the Omega Institute. I will be on the road. I will be in New York, and so we will just be doing something from the road, but there will be no live streaming from Soul Food, and that will be for the first Friday night in July. That's it for now. Think cosmically, act locally. It does no good at all to spread ourselves thin and smatter or scatter our consciousness all over the cosmos unless we apply it in our lives, in our daily lives, in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our work lives. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine.